Welcome to the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. My name is Chris Hume, managing editor of the Lancaster Patriot, and I'm joined by the pastor of Independence Reformed Bible Church, Joel Saint. Joel, thanks for joining me.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
Joel, speed limit laws versus biblical law. Joel, my first question is, have you ever gone over the speed limit?
I have plenty of times and plan to in the future, quite frankly.
Okay, well, you're tipping your hand there because one of the questions we're going to ask you is it a sin to go over the speed limit? So we'll get there in a minute. Basically, we want to ask today, are speed limit laws biblical? Is this something that the Bible authorizes the civil government to do? Is this something we should want? Is this something we need? Is this something that prevents harm? Or is this something that generates revenue mainly? That's what we're going to look at today.
And of course, we could, set up a speed limit of 1 mile an hour and have no traffic fatalities, I suppose. But we still probably would in some cases.
Right. So let's start with this story. This is from Kansas, from KSNW, just from July 18th. A driver clocked going 100 after 98 mile per hour ticket last week. So I just want to read a part of this story. One speeding ticket was not enough to stop a driver in northern Kansas from testing the speed limit again. The Phillips County Sheriff's Office, this is in Kansas, says a pickup driver was ticketed for going 98 miles per hour last week, clocked going 100 miles per hour this week. And I'm bringing this story up to give one anecdotal example of these speeding tickets that we're going to look at in a minute, Joel, amount to a lot of revenue for these townships. This is a case in point. The sheriff's office says both times were before 7 a.m., east of Phillipsburg on U.S. Highway 36. The pickup is registered in Missouri. So I have this picture here for you, Joel. Obviously, people can't see it on the podcast, but this is a picture of Highway 36 east of Phillipsburg. So this is Phillipsburg, Kansas. This is not a residential area. This is, a fairly straight road in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of fields around. So that's the context for this speeding ticket. So the sheriff posted about the two tickets on Facebook, and it said that this Missouri driver shouldn't have been surprised to see us east of Phillipsburg this morning. Last week, he was cited for 98 close to the same area. And the sheriff's office says the two tickets add up to more than $700. The 98 mile per hour citation totaled $348, $240 in fines, and then, of course, more money in court costs, over $100 in court costs. And then the 100 mile per hour ticket was $378, $270 in fines, and $108 in court costs. And the deputies encourage anyone observing vehicles traveling at a high rate of speed to call them. So that's the first story there, Joel. So almost $1,000, over $700 for these two speeding tickets early in the morning out in the middle of nowhere. So what is behind this practice?
Well, if I'm, in Phillips County, Kansas, and I am part of the county government there, I am going to be voting not for less speeding tickets. I'm going to be voting for more. And what they're going to say is we need to keep our roads safe. But where's the danger here? You're on a flat, again, the folks can't see it, but it's a straight shot road. It couldn't be any straighter going east and west. And really what we should be asking is, what is the law behind the law? Always, and maybe I'm getting ahead of us here, but what is the law behind the law? The law behind the law is one of safety. It's not arbitrary limits. Where do we get some of our speed limit laws, by the way? I saw this happening back. I'm old enough to remember 55 miles an hour with Nixon and all that kind of stuff, right? And what happened was we need to go 55 because we need to save gas so we aren't so dependent on outlets in the Middle East, right? Fight back, drive 55, right? I remember that big billboard. And then before you knew it, suddenly the Ayatollah coming over the Middle East and all that kind of stuff wasn't quite as dangerous, right? And then suddenly it shape-shifted into safety. Well, wait a minute. How did that happen? And how do we really know that this is about safety? How do we know, Chris, that it's not about money? How do we know that?
There are many cases like this. It doesn't appear that there was any danger to anyone at all.
It looks like they're not even saying that it was dangerous.
Right. It was before 7 a.m. in the morning in the middle of Kansas farm fields on a highway. My contention, and it's certainly not mine alone, is that speeding tickets and all these traffic violations are basically a big moneymaker. That's the reason behind it. And I was initially drawn to the section from the Declaration of Independence where the writer said he, referring to King George, has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. And of course, if you know your history, you had the Stamp Act and there were officers placed in every port to collect revenues. They wanted to collect money from the colonists. And that is what I think speeding tickets is an example of. It's just revenue officers collecting money.
That's quite the term, revenue officer, but that's what that would be. And as I understand, the Stamp Act was you're not allowed to use your own paper for certain types of correspondence. You have to use paper that is officially stamped by some representative of the king, but you had to pay for the stamp. So again, it was a revenue collecting thing. Let me do it this way. Growing up, you heard what I said earlier about speed limits, right? And I know that there are like pastors out there, ministers, like it's a sin to go over the speed limit, right?
Right.
Well, of course, with growing up with 6 sons, I'm going to get that question. Hey, Dad, what do you think? Is it a sin to go over the speed limit, right? And that now it's time to be really scared. Like, oh no, if I say it's not a sin, then my kids are going to go ripping down the highway 100 miles an hour, right? And so what it gave me a chance to do, Chris, is it gave me a chance to talk about God's law behind the law. And so this is the conversation that we had. It says, no, it's not a sin. If you're going to say that's a sin, then get out the Federal Register and get out I remember this, Chris, going back to, I actually took driver's education in high school. Public high school, right? And our driver's ed teacher, he brought out 2 books. One was like a little pamphlet-y thing, right? And he says to us, this is the book they give you when you go to get your license. I remember that was true. And he said, this is the book, some real big thick thing with hardcover. He says, this is the book of all their laws that they can get you on. So if you're going to tell me that it's a sin to go over the speed limit, then how is it not a sin not to obey every single code in that real thick book that you don't even know what it's about? You have no idea. So let's stop with this. We have enough real sins delineated in the Bible to worry about. Now, getting back to my story, Chris, about with my own sons, because every teenage boy wants to put the pedal to the metal and go peeling out someplace. I said, look, here's the thing. Let me ask you guys a question. Let's say you're in a town and it's 35 miles an hour and you want to go 35 miles an hour. Is there any problem with that? No. I said, okay, let's say there's super thick fog and you have like 50 feet of visibility and you still want to go 35 miles an hour. Are you breaking the law of the land? Well, no, not technically. Are you breaking God's law to love your neighbor as yourself? Yes. And safety and love for one's neighbor is the law behind the law, which I would guess that when townships and states are setting up speed limit laws, they're not really talking about love for one's neighbor. They're thinking more of the money that can be made.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And we're going to come back to some of those things which you've already laid out very clearly there. So we have this idea back in the 1700s of these offices being set up just to collect money. And you mentioned the Stamp Act, and well, you can do this, but you have to do it our way. That's the same idea with the roadways today. You can drive a car, you can have a car, you can operate a vehicle, but only if you do it our way and you pay us money. We've talked about that previously. But let's just talk about some of this, the moneymaker of speeding tickets. So speeding tickets and other motor vehicle violations make up a significant portion of town budgets, a lot of budgets. I have a story here from New York Times, and they said that many municipalities across the country rely heavily, this is a quote from them, on ticket revenue and court fees to pay for government services, and some maintain outsized police departments to help generate that money, according to a review of hundreds of municipal audit reports, town budgets, court files, and state highway records. So we're going to come back to that story. First, this is from Forbes, and the title is Nearly 600 Towns Get 10% of Their Budgets or More from Court Fines. It talks about speed traps. There's all these speed traps throughout America, and it talks about one specific place as an example. It says, take Seat Pleasant, Maryland, right on the border with Washington, D.C. Fines collected from speed and red light cameras formed nearly half of the town's budget. Though Seat Pleasant has a mere 4,800 residents, it manages to employ a staggering 24 full-time sworn officers, including a 3-person dedicated automated speed enforcement unit and a drone aviation unit. There's a hint here that speeding tickets and traffic violations are big money makers.
I was in Maryland and got myself a fine for speeding. Yeah, I got it through the mail. They had some kind of like remote thing set up, and they took a picture of my license and sent me I can't even remember how much it was. Now, if I could sit down with them and say, you know what, okay, I violated your little speed limit thing here. Can you tell me if I was actually being dangerous or not? Can you look me in the face and say, you were endangering other people? I have no doubt they could never say that.
I'm actually going to skip ahead here now to an article since you brought that up. This is from a couple days ago as well, July 17th, and this is in California. It says, Bay Area drivers may soon get automatic tickets for going 11 miles per hour over speed limit. And it says, drivers may soon get speeding tickets without ever talking to an officer, to your point, if a bill gets approved authorizing speed limit cameras. So perhaps they already have this in Maryland. This is in the San Francisco area. And it says the program would give speeding drivers a ticket by using speed cameras and an automatic billing system, according to Assembly Bill 645. The speed safety system shall capture images of the rear license plate of vehicles that are traveling 11 miles per hour or more over the posted speed limit, and notice of violation shall be issued to vehicles based on that evidence. Fees would start at $50. And could go up from there. So yeah, there you have it. Purely a moneymaker. But the real issue here, we're going to ask a few questions of this. But let's first get to this New York Times story. And the title of this one is The Demand for Money Behind Many Police Traffic Stops. And I do have to agree with the writers in the main gist of their article here, and that is that the need for money and revenue is driving so much of this. So I want to read a few portions of this, and then we'll get into application here. The article says, and again, this is from New York Times, it says, fueling the culture of traffic stops is the federal government, which issues over $600 million a year in highway safety grants that subsidize ticket writing. Although federal officials say they do not impose quotas, at least 20 states have evaluated police performance on the number of traffic stops per hour, which critics say contributes to over-policing and erosion of public trust, particularly among members of certain racial groups. Now, they go on to say a hidden scaffolding of financial incentives underpins the policing of motorists in the U.S., encouraging some communities to essentially repurpose armed officers as revenue agents searching for infractions largely unrelated to public safety.
There you go.
So they use the term revenue agents. Yep. They go on to say, as a result, driving is one of the most common daily routines during which people have been shot, tased, beaten, or arrested after minor offenses. Now, it's hard to argue with that. Our roadways have become a locus of tyranny, where you can be pulled over and demanded to identify yourself and all these things. And there's been lots and lots of stories where a routine traffic stop has turned into something worse. And sometimes the fault is with the people driving the vehicle. Sometimes the fault is with the police. But what's unquestionable is that the money behind this is a huge factor.
You know, there's no moral, in what you just read there, there's no moral imperative here. If it's unrelated to public safety, what's it related to? It's just related to making money. I mean, there's no difference here, Chris, if they said, well, okay, today we're going to fine anybody with red hair, for example. Tomorrow it'll be anybody with brown eyes. This is arbitrary here. We're always sold on public safety, but it's ultimately arbitrary going on here. Arbitrary equals tyranny. It just does, because it's not equal justice.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about the speed, and that there could be times where your speeding is reckless. But the point here that I want people to hear is that we already know that the civil government does these things arbitrarily for money. For example, the issue of registration or a driver's license, those things are not about safety. That's about, hey, you just need to jump through these hoops in order to have the quote-unquote freedom to travel on the road. That's not about justice. That's arbitrary. That's a moneymaker. We should not be shocked when we look at the speeding tickets or red light cameras and say, well, the motive behind this really isn't safety. It's about money. And there's a lot of money in speeding tickets and traffic violations.
Yeah, you know, and I know there's probably some folks out there right now saying, hey, this is terrible. He's questioning speed limits, you know. But all I'm really saying is we have grown used to the strangling nature of the state. And we would actually defend it. But you cannot defend what's going on here, Chris. It's not related to public safety, many of these things. Why then is it? And as a pastor, I have no problem speaking out against these types of things, because the people that I'm responsible for that attend our fellowship, they should never be subjected to any tyranny whatsoever. They should be subjected to the law of God and nothing more and nothing less.
They quote a police officer here in this story. This is Gil Kurlikowski, a former police chief in Seattle and 3 other cities. And he said this, and this goes against, people usually say, oh no, there's no quotas on speeding tickets. That's a myth. The police departments aren't out there trying to get speeding tickets. They're just out there trying to keep everybody safe. But this is one former police chief who says the message goes out that if you want more training, then go ahead and write more traffic tickets. And throughout the story, they go into this multiple police departments where the heads of the department, police chiefs or whatever, are like, hey, you guys are not performing. We're not getting enough violations. Get out there and get more. And again, that makes sense. It checks out because if this is a huge source of funding, and funding is always a huge issue with police departments and many other civil government departments, it makes perfect sense. I mean, why wouldn't you write more tickets in order to get more money if that's how it's set up?
You know, Chris, not to beat the dead horse, but it should be. You know what? We have a lot of traffic fatalities. Get out there and write those tickets to cut down on the traffic fatalities. But that's not even mentioned. There's another thing going on here, okay? Tell me what you think of this. I'd be interested. You can't be, they don't want to be consistent in enforcing the speed limit. You have to be kind of arbitrary with it to get enough people to actually speed. Chris, if you really crack down all the time, that's why I think this California bill, I really question if it's going to pass or if they're going to be consistent with it. Because in order to make money, you have to be very inconsistent with your enforcement. If you're inconsistent, then you can get people. But if you were super consistent, if it really was about public safety, you would collect a lot less money. So it's fraudulent through and through.
That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but it's hard to argue with. There's much more we could say here. Let me see what else we have. Yeah, the Bay Area one where they actually say that the CDC says 26% of all vehicle crashes occurred because of a speeding driver.
If this is California, I want to know how many crashes occurred because these people were wearing masks in their car and had passed out from hypoxia.
Yeah,
but I'm sort of kidding.
Now on the other side, Joel, there are efforts to raise speed limits. For example, this is from landline.media. Pursuit in North Dakota to authorize higher top speeds on the state's fastest roadways was turned back twice. State law authorizes speeds of 75 miles per hour on Interstate 29 and 94. Speeds along 4-lane divided highways are set to 70. 2-lane highways are posted at 65. In March, Governor Doug Burgum vetoed a bill, this is in again, North Dakota, to increase speed limits for all drivers on interstate highways. The legislature approved the bill that would authorize vehicles to travel 80 miles per hour on interstates, but the governor cited safety concerns as reasons for his veto. So some people are at least saying, hey, let's raise these limits. In this case, the governor said, no, it's not going to be safe.
How about if we do this? How about if we turn the road, it's interstate, so it's a little bit harder to do that, reminding us everyone again that the first interstate was actually a private interstate. So now we have these state-sponsored interstates, and so I guess if the state's going to be responsible for your safety, then I guess they can throw out their speed limit laws. But did Governor Doug Burgum bring any, he cited safety concerns. Is there any studies out there? I doubt that there really are, because right next door, Montana, they got rid of some speed limit laws on their interstates years ago. And I've been looking for articles pointing out that they now have higher traffic fatalities, and I haven't been able to find them. Now, maybe they're out there, Chris, but I haven't seen them. And this was a long time ago. I think we're talking like 20 years ago. With all these talk about speed limit laws, we should be able to go to Montana and say, look at all those people dying. I just wonder if without a speed limit law, if people are now more safety conscious. Now, I can't prove this, but if you went out there and there were and you did not have speed limit laws and you didn't rest in them, well, I'm going the speed limit, I'm not paying attention, would you pay more attention to what you're doing without speed limit laws? And would traffic fatalities actually go down? I would like to know the answer to that question.
And a lot of the problem here is because the government has taken over the roads. I wasn't thinking about this prior, but if you had a private highway, a private road, you could have a speed limit as part of the requirements for coming on here because this is privately owned. We could talk about that. I wasn't planning on it, but that's a good point. Privately operated, then it's no longer the government punishing you for doing something that's not evil. It's a private property owner saying, hey, you're free to use this property. Here's how fast I would like you to go.
Private roads. Okay, on this, I probably shouldn't have brought it up, but here we are. I got into a discussion with my wife about this the other day, and this is what I said to her. I said, if we had private roads, I think we would have far less intersections. I think you'd see far more bridges, because if you have private roads and somebody owns the road, one of the things they're going to want to brag about is how safe it is. There's most accidents by far happen at intersections on these non interstates. It's intersections where they happen. And so what you would want to do with private roads is you would want to cut down on the accidents, which would probably allow for far more bridges, probably allow for, when you have more bridges, then you have more walkways for pedestrians. I find it impossible to believe that if the roads were privatized, they would be better and safer.
You think they would be better and safer if they were
absolutely
privatized?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
Okay. All right. Let's get into some application now here regarding specifically speed limits, okay? Because there are still some questions related to this. I mean, let's just take it down to the level of nobody likes a reckless speeding driver. Now, again, speeding can be a bit arbitrary, so we're using the term reckless. So nobody wants reckless drivers in their neighborhood. We live on a road that people go pretty fast on sometimes, and I do wish at times they would slow down. But the questions we have to ask are at least three. There's other questions, but when it comes to attempts to prevent reckless speeding, what is biblically warranted? What is practical? And what would be most effective? I think the answer to all three questions is the same, and that's one of the beauties of biblical law and God's word.
Amen.
A lot of people say, well, that's what God's word says, but it's not practical or it's not effective. I think it's actually the opposite. When you have these unbiblical measures, they're actually not practical or effective. So we have speed limit laws in my community. Doesn't prevent people from going over them. Now, whether that is the limit that I think is safe is another topic, but let me ask you, I'm going to ask you 4 questions first, and then hopefully we'll be able to get into these 3 questions as we go. What should be the biblical response to reckless speeding? Okay. So first of all, you've already kind of answered this. I wanted to ask you at some point in this podcast, is it a sin to drive over the speed limit? You've already said no to that. And I think you kind of answered the second question. Is it a sin to be reckless to the point of endangering others? And then the third one, I'm going to put all 3 together and then let you just put your answer again. Are those things always the same? So I know you touched on this already, but just answer that again if you don't mind.
Yeah, those things are definitely not always the same. For example, as we address it, a sin to drive over the speed limit, it's a sin to endanger others, no matter what the speed limit is. Now, why do I say that endangering others? We're talking now about, and this is this great commandment that Christ gave that covers, frankly, Chris, so much of what we're talking about here. First commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. Second one, love your neighbor as yourself. And I want to mention in context here also, or in connection, the golden rule. As you would that others would do to you, do to them likewise. And then Christ qualifies it. For this is the law and the prophets. So on a little bit of a tangent here, I love when people say, well, all religions have the golden rule. No, they don't. If they don't have the law and the prophets, they don't have the golden rule, because Christ said the law and the prophets is the golden rule. I like to bring that for my friends who say, I just go by the New Testament. Well, if you just go by the New Testament, then, bro, you don't have the golden rule. That's what Christ said. But anyway, that's an aside. Are these things always the same? No, they're not always the same. Question. Ambulance has to get somebody to the hospital. Going over the speed limit. Everybody says, no, it's okay in that case. Well, is the ambulance driver necessarily endangering others? No. It is not a necessary endangerment of someone else to exceed the speed limit, which we've already established often has little or nothing to do with safety to begin with. And I would give a quick example here in my neighborhood. Right, we have a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit, which I basically adhere to. Sometimes I go faster. What do I do when I see someone walking their dog? I don't. Well, okay, I'm going to go 15. No, I slow down even more. Just because I don't want I don't want them to feel endangered, right? I'm not saying, well, I can go the speed limit, so no. These things are definitely not always the same.
With that, so it's not a sin to drive over the speed limit.
Definitely not.
It is a sin to be reckless and careless and endanger other people.
Yes,
right?
It's because that's a violation of loving your neighbor as yourself.
Right. That's a violation of the higher law, the law of God.
Yep.
So there could be times where you're going under the speed limit and you are endangering others.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Number 4 here then, is the civil government authorized to punish, and this brings us to really one of the main issues that people have. Is the civil government authorized to punish preemptively in cases of recklessness that could lead to death? So let's agree for the moment that there is a point where you are driving recklessly and you could harm someone. It's hard to know where that mile per hour mark is that now you're reckless, now you're not. Law enforcement doesn't even really know. They usually have this buffer. Sometimes it's 5 miles per hour, sometimes it's 10. But is the government authorized to punish preemptively in cases of recklessness that have not harmed anyone or killed anyone?
First of all, in God's law, generally speaking, what you're talking about, punishment, is when harm is actually done. Now, in this case of what you're talking about, Chris, we haven't done any harm yet. We could do harm. Here's how I would address this. From the Ecclesiastes passage that we looked at last week, because we don't have speedy justice here. Men's hearts are set on doing evil things. But here's the thing, what I would say. If you're endangering others by, let's say, drunken driving, now that would cut out an awful lot. Drunken driving, for example. But someone's going to say, well, now you're punishing someone preemptively. But I believe in Exodus probably 21, it would take some time to look at that. But I believe there, what you have is you have negligence, and there is punishment for negligence in the Bible. Now, if we were able to develop a method of punishing negligence consistently, then I think what you would see is a lot less recklessness.
I want to talk about some of those cases here in a minute, but I want to get clarification from you. I think you said initially that civil government should not punish preemptively if no harm has taken place.
Yes.
So would your position be the speed limit law, if you're going over the speed limit, you should not be punished by the civil government, even if it is reckless speed?
That is correct. By the civil authorities, that is correct.
Okay. All right.
You need to have a population that can control themselves and love their neighbors themselves. If you don't have that, there's no law that's except a top-down tyranny, like everybody's in prison type of a society.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of those categories then with murder, manslaughter. But the parapet law in Deuteronomy 22, verse 8, that law in Scripture, I'm going to actually read it here. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house, if anyone should fall from it. Now, it appears to me that the only penalty there is if harm followed from the carelessness, if you will. Because they hosted people on their roofs, they should have had a railing around it. If they weren't hosting people up there, they wouldn't need one. But the parapet law says if you do not take these basic measures to protect your guests, then you will be held liable for their death. Can we apply that to speed limit laws? And is that kind of in harmony with what you're saying, that if we are to have speed limit laws, we have the signs up, here's the speed limit, they could be used to say, if harm has been done and you were going over the speed limit, well, now we take that into consideration as far as your level of recklessness or carelessness in the case.
Yeah, so what we're running into here is the problem we've talked about, public land versus private property. This parapet law applies to your private property. Now, what if, let's say in your neighborhood, what if you owned that part of the road in front of your house? And so you got together with the other residents and said, you know what? We want it to be 25 through here, and we can do that because we owned this part of the road. Now, anyone wants to come through here faster, they're going to pay a fine to us. You might be able to sort of kind of live with that a little bit. You're like, maybe someone has to go through here really quickly, whatever. All right, they're going to pay the fine to us. Now you are, I think, lining up with the parapet law, but you can only do it in a private setting, because this is a private setting here. This is what you can do. When you talk about what the state does, now we're into a fuzzy land, it seems to me, because the Bible does not give, that I know of, the state the authority to set speed limit laws and set up all these safety regulations. If the land was privatized, then the people who are actually in danger, in this case you, in the neighborhood, could set the rules. But now we have the state setting the rules, and they don't even care about safety, as we've already established in this podcast.
All right, I just want to push you on that a little bit. I agree with you a lot on the private thing, but there's still an element here, and we'll maybe get to it with some of these other categories, like the ox that was known to gore and ends up killing someone. There's still a role for the righteous civil ruler, civil magistrate. So I'm saying at most, if we are going to have speed limit laws, there would be no penalty for going over the speed limit. Just like the parapet law, it was on private property, but it seems to me that if someone died on your property, it moved from being a solely private thing to somewhat of a public thing, where the civil magistrate could get involved and we'd have a biblical trial and all those things. What I'm saying is simply as an application, if we were to allow speed limit laws in any sense, they would only be there as the parapet law is. I get that's private property, but the concept being this is the regulation. No penalty comes to you if you don't hurt anyone. But if you injure someone because of your recklessness, that will be taken into account. So do you think that's at least something to consider?
Yeah, I would flip it a little bit, though, this way. Let's say that we agree that we have speed limit laws, Chris, to prevent recklessness, okay? What then do we do with someone who is still being reckless even while going under the speed limit?
Right.
How would we address that then?
Right, and that gets to our next point. So let's bring that to our next category here, because this is what we're getting into. So this issue turns to justice and death and harm caused, because that should really be our interest here. We want to protect life, and so therefore we don't want people to be reckless. And the Bible certainly teaches that, and we have some examples here. So let's just start from the top. I have some categories here. The first one is intentional murder. So you go out, you have malice aforethought, you want to kill someone, and you murder them. That's clearly prohibited in Scripture, punishable with death.
And we have some of these categories ourselves, right? We have murder 1, 2, 3,
Right.
and that kind of thing, right?
These are probably not the technical legal terms,
Right.
but I want to look to the Bible and see, okay, what are the categories there? So that's the first one. That could certainly happen on the roadway. Someone could say, you know what, there's a person, and I want to run them over with my vehicle. I'm going to make the point at the end here that what we really need is not more laws or regulations, but wisdom and judgment. And so I want to go through these and then get to that point. So you have first intentional murder, and then you have people that have caused death by their own carelessness and recklessness. For example, the parapet law that we talked about, and there's also the case of the ox known to gore in times past in Exodus 21. And the issue there is that if the ox did it once and it was, reasonable that the owner did not know this would happen, that's one thing. But if it was known to happen and the owner did nothing about it, that's taken into account by the judges to say, you knew about this, you knew that this ox was known to gore and that this is an animal capable of killing a human being, and you did nothing about it, and the ox went out and killed someone. Again, if the owner knew about it and didn't do anything, but the ox never gored anybody in God's providence, there's no penalty. But the ox did, it killed someone, and so this owner of the ox can be put to death. Now, the third category is, it appears to me there's the distinction here of involuntary manslaughter, where a person unintentionally causes the death of an innocent bystander. Now, we might say these meld together, because did the owner of the ox intentionally, have his ox kill that person? No, but he was certainly reckless to a point that the judges would say, hey, you're responsible for this. In this case, and this is where I was having a bit of a hard time, and I would like more time to study this, but in the cases of the cities of refuge, it seems to me it's somewhat of a lesser culpability than the previous one. They should have known potentially this could have killed someone, but it wasn't as reckless as the owner of the ox who didn't do anything. The final distinction I have is death of a reckless person. So I caused the death of a reckless person. So I'm the reasonable person in this case. I caused the death of a reckless person. For example, the case of the thief breaking into a home in Exodus 22, and the homeowner ends up killing that thief. Now, that's a pretty clear example. Whether he intended to or not, this is someone in his home at night. He doesn't know, what their intentions are, and he tries to defend his home or family, and the thief ends up dying. The Bible says there's no blood guilt for that. So I think an application of that could be, someone running out in front of a car. Someone does something reckless and careless, and the person driving on the road was behaving in a way that was reasonable, and they were put in a situation where there was nothing they could do to prevent this death. Again, I would like to have studied it more, but I think some people might say, well, the involuntary manslaughter applies to any death that you cause. But I think there's a distinction there that if I have done nothing here to actually cause this with my actions and someone put themselves in harm's way, well, now this is not even a case of involuntary manslaughter where they would need to flee to the city of refuge. So those are the four categories. Any comments on those?
I'm going to take this again to the breakdown of the family, and here's how I'm going to do it. When I was growing up, my father was a safety nutcase. We used to say, he was just all about and he would teach us safety. He would teach us things like look both ways before you go across the road. That was my father that taught me that. Now, what are we going to do as the family breaks down and we don't have fathers anymore? Oh, well, the mother can be the father. No, the mother is the mother, and the mother can't be the father. I remember this. I remember one night, and somebody could say, and a statist is going to have a problem with what I'm saying now, because for the statist, who cares about the family? Only the state can define safety, and only the state can keep you safe. I'm going to tell you a story about what happened when I was very young. I was a friend of mine and I were talking. My father overheard it, talking about like scaring a friend of ours at night by banging on his window at night. And my father said, "Don't you dare do that. People defend their property. That could get you killed." And what he was telling me was, if you got killed by scaring somebody at night in some kind of threatening way, it's not their fault. You shouldn't have been doing that.
Right.
Now, see, what we do then, we want to test all the limits and say, well, if I do this or that, is that really manslaughter? Is that really, justified homicide and all that kind of stuff? Well, why don't we bring the father back into the home here, which we've abandoned, fathers who will teach their children what safety is all about. And I don't know if my dad ever really had a car accident. I've had a couple. I know this, growing up, we hardly ever broke any bones. And it wasn't like we were in prison all the time. We went out, we ran and played like everyone else. But I remember my father teaching me about road safety. He did not teach me, stop is basic, right? You know what he taught me, Chris? He taught me, listen, you're responsible for your own safety. You need to drive like everybody else is either drunk or crazy. You need to look out for them. You think you have a green light? You're good, but you need to look to make sure that nobody's running the red. Chris, I can't answer every single thing, but I can say this. If we had homes again and fathers that taught their children safety like my dad and me, we would need a lot less of these status type laws. And I don't think I even answered your question, but
no, that's fine. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think my main point here is that these are categories that we see in Scripture, and even in our law today, we have these categories, right? And I think they're legitimate categories. And so people are going to say, well, if you don't want speed limit laws enforced preemptively, then we're going to have all these people speeding and people dying. And I think that's not true. And I think actually, if we actually applied the biblical law more faithfully, we would have, and you mentioned this with reckless driving, whether it's drunk driving or other, recklessness, and you cause someone's death, well, you could be put to death for that. My point here is that,
Chris, not to interrupt you, but if drunken driving and someone was killed through a drunken driver, and that was the life of the drunken driver, I think we would see quite a chilling effect on drunken driving.
Right, absolutely.
But we don't want to do that.
Yeah, and I think that would be a case of applying these principles and the general equity of recklessness in adjudicating after it happens. That's one of the key points, that in biblical law, biblical justice, the penalty for recklessness only comes if your recklessness caused harm. I think that is the answer. Now, we need wisdom, not in making new laws or setting the speed limits, but in judging after the fact when it happens. Again, I'll allow maybe this category of speed limits if and only if it's put in place so that if something happens, it just gives you one thing to look at, but it can't even be the only thing, because even today with speed limits, there are cases when you're going over the speed limit for a justified reason. So they could be there as suggestions, but the penalty can only come if you harm someone, if you harm them physically, if you kill them, in the case of driving on the roadway. So this is another reason why we need godly rulers, not statist legislators, because more and more laws isn't solving the problem. And we need people who will judge righteously and say, okay, here's the situation. This person was driving down the road at this speed. There were this many people around, whatever, whether they were drunk, not drunk, and take all the factors into consideration and then rule. Was this a case of a reckless death? Was this a case of another category of involuntary manslaughter? Or was this a case where the person that died was being careless themselves and the driver of the vehicle should have no liability in this? That's what we need. If we moved in that direction, people would be a lot more understanding of the idea that we don't need law enforcement to go around with their, speed guns and say, oh, you were going over the speed limit and you got to pay a fine, irregardless of whether or not they even say they were being reckless. That's the issue here. This is not about righteousness or justice. It's not really even about preventing people from dying, because if you really wanted to prevent the reckless drivers, you would have serious penalties, including your own life, if your recklessness causes the death of another. So that simple principle, I think, could be applied to reckless driving.
Yeah, and I want to clarify something I said earlier. I believe I said Montana doesn't have speed limits. Their speed limit is 80 miles an hour on their interstates. When that was introduced years ago, that was being said by people as well. You might as well not even have a speed limit then, because people are going to go over. So they do have speed limits, but that was being introduced when a lot of interstates were still at 55,
right?
And people were appalled by that type of a thing.
Yeah, and real quick, Joel, the idea of, we have in our society this civil criminal distinction where you can have a criminal case and then a civil case. Is that a biblical distinction? Because in the Bible, if you wrong someone, the judges would rule, hey, here's what happened, here's the evidence, here's the witnesses, and if you're guilty of this, well, here's the penalty. And a lot of times that could be a fine, right? And that's the criminal case. So now we have it. You have criminal and civil. Is that an extra biblical distinction that we should try to move away from?
Yeah, this is something I've considered, and I believe it's very difficult to make that distinction, because if I've harmed someone, that's the biblical distinction. Did someone else receive harm from something that I did? Okay, so if it's not, what is it? If it's not bad enough, then it's civil. If it's really bad, then it's criminal,
or both. You can do.
Yeah, you can do both, and we've done both now. You can beat a criminal case in court and then still be
right.
Attacked civilly, if you will, because our strict, and I would even say proper in many cases, laws were not violated. Someone defended themselves, let's say, against someone from another race, right? Okay, you know what? You were legit in that self-defense, but you violated their civil rights. We're going to lay the civil case on you now, and I believe that's wicked and ungodly.
And that's something that comes up with a lot of this stuff. I mean, so much happens on our roadways, so much tyranny, so many civil, criminal issues. If we move back to biblical law, it would be much more simple, and the only need you'd have for civil government is righteous judges, righteous rulers to adjudicate, to judge. Here's something that happened. Here's an injury. Here's a death. Now, who's responsible for this, and what should the penalty be?
Chris, your distinction, your question here, I think would clarify and lift a lot of fog, quite frankly. Is there a difference? Is there a distinction in the scriptures between civil and criminal law? If we could ask that question, I've never really thought about this to the extent that we're talking about it now. If we could ask that question, then we might get back to the question of harm, which we see all throughout the scriptures in terms of civil law and criminal law, which we make a big distinction. But why not just ask the question, where's the harm? Forget about the civil criminal distinction. Where's the harm, and what's the remedy?
Further and further we get away from biblical law, the more and more distinctions we have, and the more and more laws we have, the more and more regulations, and none of it is dealing with the issue, which is punishing evil. And that's the issue with these distinctions and categories I've laid out here, that in the Bible, the issue is we need to deal with evil. And we're not going to be able to get into cities of refuge, but even in that case, they would say, look, this person was not worthy of death for the involuntary manslaughter, but there was still some certain stipulations in there. But then you have the case of the death of a reckless person. So there's biblical law lays out, if you are being reckless and you cause the death of someone, then, it's your head, basically. You're guilty of that death, and you should be held accountable for it. That's not how our system does it. We have all these other things in there. So if you are, if you kill someone drunk driving, you're not going to be executed. But biblically, if you were careless and reckless and you knew that getting in that vehicle, again, that would be where we have the general equity. It requires wisdom to apply that, because they didn't have drunk driving, so to speak, in the Old Testament. But this principle of causing recklessness was there. And again, you're not making a law preemptively. You're saying, okay, if you kill someone, now we need to apply the biblical wisdom in this case. And I think that would be a case of you were reckless. And that could apply to speeding, theoretically. Again, it takes wisdom. But I think what is clear is that the Bible does not authorize the civil government to punish someone for simply speeding or being reckless when no harm was done. And that's the key issue that I want people to leave with.
Yeah, I mean, could we make a statement that not all recklessness is speeding? Let's say we're talking about on the road, and not all speeding is reckless.
Right.
We could make that case. So let's concentrate on what is reckless here.
Yeah. And if we
the
really,
results.
And if we really want to cut down on reckless deaths, which we should, then that's what we should punish. But that's not what we're punishing. We're punishing people who are just driving down the road, not being reckless. So that's not going to cut down on reckless deaths. If we want to cut down on reckless deaths, then we should punish people who cause reckless deaths, and we should punish them according to biblical law, which would be up to their life. So that's the issue here. And thinking that speed limits are helping with this, I think, is foolish. But hopefully this gives people some things to think about here.
People will mock the idea of private roads and private speed limits. But I'm going to counter that with what happened with me at Federal Express. I used to be a Federal Express courier, and they had this. It was called the Smith system, and I can't remember all their directives, but one of them was aim high in steering. In other words, when you're steering around something close, you usually have the problem near you rather than on the other side. So aim high in steering. Make sure they see you was another one. In other words, you're coming up to a intersection. You're not just busting through it. You're locking eyes with the person who's at the stop sign. You have the right of way. You're locking eyes with that person to make sure that he sees you. Now, what happened was there were people that had accidents at FedEx that the state said was not your fault. But if you violated FedEx's rules, then you were in trouble with FedEx.
Right.
And you didn't have too many of those accidents till you lost your job. So the private people there were actually more safe than what the state was. So don't tell me that the private people won't be safe. FedEx was.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. All right. Well, hopefully this gives people something to think about with the speed limit laws. I don't think they are biblically justified in the sense that you can be penalized for doing something that has not harmed anyone on the roadways. Much more we could say here, and we always try to address these issues from a biblical perspective. Joel, anything you want to share about the upcoming conference with the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society that you are part of, really applying the Bible to different areas of life as well, something we try to do on the podcast. So tell our listeners about that conference. Yes,
the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society is sponsoring a conference right here in Lancaster County, Manheim Township, at the Spooky Nook Sports Center. And our speaker is going to be Dr. James White, who has been involved in numerous debates defending orthodoxy. And we're hoping to get a debate up this time. I'm not going to say anything more about that. We're hoping for another debate Saturday evening. But put it on your calendar, please. It's September 15th and 16th, just a little bit less than a month from right now. And we have an early bird special. If you sign up before the end of July, $99 for the entire weekend. That includes a keynote speech from James on Friday night. And we're going to have multiple sessions on Saturday. We call them exposition talks. It's just an 18 or 19, maybe even 20-minute talk on some area of our conference theme, Chris. And our conference theme is the gospel at war. Now, we purposely stated it that way because there's plenty of folks that would say the gospel doesn't go to war with anything. But I would counter that by saying all of the scripture is the gospel, from Genesis through the end of Revelation. It's all the gospel. And Jesus Christ said he would put enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. There is constant war between the two. And the gospel, Chris, is either going to be at war or is going to be at peace. There's no détente, if you will, with even James saying it's don't you understand, my brothers, that friendship with the world is enmity with God. There's no Paul asking what concord has Christ with Belial. So our theme is the gospel at war, and we'll have various speakers. You'll be speaking. Tell me what you'll be speaking on again, Chris.
The gospel at war with the yellow bus.
With the yellow bus. Yeah, that's a good one. We're going to have the gospel at war with modern missiology, the gospel at war with the pulpit. We have an awful lot of apostate pastors out there. Right. And this is, you're going to hear things here at this conference that people are just not talking about, which is consistent with our goal at the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society and what you and I do here. We talk about those topics that the Bible addresses, but that many folks are just kind of scared to address. So September 15th and 16th, it's going to be at the Spooky Nook Sports Center in Mannheim, and a real good number, early bird special of $99, which includes a substantial snack and in the evening, and a very substantial meal as well.
Saturday lunch.
That's Saturday lunch. Yep. That's right. So it's a great number. We're super excited. We hope to be able to tell you about a debate coming up. We don't have that nailed down exactly yet, but see us at futureofchristendom.org. That's all one word, futureofchristendom.org for more information. Hope to see you there. Introduce yourself to me if you make it, and tell me that you heard about us on the Lancaster Patriot Podcast.
Again, for more information about that's futureofchristendom.org. For more information about Pastor Joel, you can go to irbc.church. Obviously, Lancaster Patriot. You can find out more about us at thelancasterpatriot.com. Subscribe to this podcast and share it with your friends. We hope to continue to bring you the news and biblical commentary on it. Until next time, God bless and Godspeed.